right, welcome back. So glad you're here. This video is continuing a series on aesthetic relativism. And, even among people that I meet who are not relativist about truth or ontology or morality or religion, they tend to kind of get a little wobbly on aesthetic relativism. So in my book, Relativism, A Guide for the Perplexed, I have a chapter on aesthetic relativism, where I deal with a couple of arguments for aesthetic relativism and try and show that those arguments fail. There are two main arguments for aesthetic relativism that I deal with in the chapter, and one of them is the argument from the subjectivity of aesthetic properties, putative subjectivity, and I try and show that that type of argument fails. One argument type is from Hume, another from C.S. Lewis's Abolition of Man. There's another video on that you can check out on the channel. But in this video, I'm going to give an argument for aesthetic relativism from aesthetic diversity, and try and show that that argument fails. So that the two main types of arguments for aesthetic relativism both fail, and that implies that the question of should I be an aesthetic relativism should be answered in the negative. No, you should not. Now, again, this doesn't give a defense or a long account of aesthetic objectivity. That would probably need to be done in a discussion of the nature of aesthetics as such, and I do have a separate video on that on James Schall's a little chapter from his book, The Order of Things, called The Order of Beauty. You can check that out on the channel as well. All right, so an argument from aesthetic diversity, in addition to arguments from the subjectivity of aesthetic properties, gives us some motivation for aesthetic relativism, which comes from the fact that both individuals and groups of people, whole groups of people, differ radically, sometimes greatly, over what counts as being beautiful or ugly. So, Joseph Margolis, very astute philosopher, in his work from the late 80s, let me get you that title here, called Robust Relativism, in a book called Philosophy Looks at the Arts, from 1987, Temple University Press. It gives an argument for relativistic conceptions of aesthetic appreciation, that's what he calls it, which makes use of the facts of aesthetic diversity. So here's two consideration that Margolis's argument rests on. Consideration one, quote, works of art are culturally emergent entities which are notoriously open to intentional quarrels. And there's no obvious way in which to show that incompatible characterizations of cultural items can be sorted as correct or incorrect in such a way that a relativistic account would be precluded. Okay, so in other words, just pick any work of art. Could be a movie, could be a novel, could be a painting, could be a statue, whatever. There's all kinds of quarrels over works of art. Okay, so that's consideration one. Consideration two, values themselves are non-cognitive. That's a heavy claim. As human persons are culturally emergent entities, consequently the prospects of avoiding a relativistic account of values and evaluated judgments is nearly nil. That means zero. Right? Okay, so these are two things that Margolis says give us considerations we ought to take into account in developing our view that we should be aesthetic relativists because of diversity of aesthetic opinion. So it seems to me that Margolis's first point is simply a restatement of the general argument for relativism that's given for philosophical relativism in general. Margolis's claims first that there are standards of evaluation of works of art which arise within a culture. Okay, fine. It could be a culture of art critics, could be a broader culture, could be you and your friends, could just be you. But standards of evaluation arise. Second, there's no neutrality between competing standards of evaluation, thus relativism follows. But I've argued that a generalization of relativism about knowledge along these same lines is problematic because it's self-defeating. So again, any form of relativism, aesthetic, ontological, religious, political, moral, and including aesthetic, will fall prey to the same self-refuting problem that relativistic thinking in philosophy generally does. Can a similar argument be placed here? Is it self-defeating to maintain both that works of art or natural entities are judged to be beautiful only by some standard of aesthetic evaluation, and further, there's no neutrality between standards of evaluation? So let me present this following simplified argument against epistemic relativism. Okay, this is how the self-refuting problem arises. Here's the standard, what I call a standard argument against epistemic relativism. If there's a standard by which epistemic relativism is judged to be false, then ER is false. Well, there is a standard by which ER is judged to be false, therefore it's false. This argument seems to work when referring to knowledge claims, since the relativistic position about knowledge seems to require a neutral position if it's going to be asserted at all. But does an argument for aesthetic relativism make such a mistake as well? Think of, here's an argument that follows the same structure. 1. If there's a standard by which AR, I call that aesthetic relativism, is judged to be false, then AR is false. There's a standard by which AR is judged to be false, therefore AR is false. The problem with this argument is that AR is about aesthetics, not about knowledge. And in premise 2, the standard appealed to here by means of AR is judged to be false would be an epistemic standard, not an aesthetic one. So this argument on the face of it is unsound. There might be two ways to avoid this problem. One way would be to collapse AR into ER. So you take the aesthetic argument, reduce it to an epistemic one, by showing that AR is a species of ER. The aesthetic argument is a species of an epistemic argument against relativism, with claims about knowledge applied only to a limited realm of our knowledge about beauty. So if this works, then the standards by which AR is judged to be false are simply epistemic standards applied to the realm of aesthetics. Thus the argument is sound, as AR is simply a limit case of ER. Okay, so that's one way to do it. I think that might work. Another way to avoid this problem is to argue that any argument for AR itself contains an aesthetic element that is itself immune from the relativist claim. Seems like an odd thing to do, to posit that arguments themselves have aesthetic elements in them, which, contrary to the relativistic claim, are thought to be beautiful in a neutral way. This is to say that any relativistic argument for aesthetic relativism would either have contained within it, as a work of art, if arguments can be works of art, a property of being lovely, elegance is often used as an aesthetic quality in mathematics, or beautiful, or it would not. But if such an argument were elegant, then of course the relativistic position would have to be abandoned. If such an argument weren't elegant, then well, its elegance is a condition for the goodness of an argument or a position to hold, thus the relativist position would be weakened. Now, these considerations point to the possibility of the interconnectivity of the aesthetic with the epistemic. And I'd go deeper and say it's to the ontic as well. This is something I thought about more since I wrote this book. The ideas presented here seem to be a bit tendentious and possibly need to be fleshed out in more detail. Suffice it to say for now that if the rational persuasiveness of an argument depends on any aesthetic property within it, any argument for aesthetic relativism would be inconsistent. Right? So this I think is a major problem. I mean, relativism, it seems like in all of its forms, has this self-refuting problem. So here's another example of this. The notion of a form of an argument, maybe you've heard that before, that could be an aesthetic one, not a merely logical one. If so, this could make a formally valid argument beautiful. So I owe that suggestion to an old colleague of mine, Professor Todd Bates. Got me thinking on that. A little footnote there in the text here. Okay. So it seems to me relativism in all its forms is going to be self-refuting. But let's look at Margolis' second point raised a few moments ago. Let me read that second point again. Again, back to Margolis. He says, quote, values themselves are non-cognitive as human persons are, quote, culturally emergent entities. Consequently, the prospects of avoiding a relativistic account of values is nearly nil. This point is that his point here is that values themselves are non-cognitive. The idea of values being non-cognitive means generally that values themselves do not exist in objects, and I just talked about that in another video. And the value judgments are neither cognitively true nor false. There's a variety of non-cognitive positions about values, motivism, prescriptivism, etc. It's beyond the scope of this book and this video to sort out the details of those positions, but let's instead consider what Margolis' claims amount to. Okay. Margolis claims that since values themselves are non-cognitive, then relativism follows. So here's the self-refuting part that comes in again. It's really hard to avoid this. The question that immediately comes to the mind is this: is this position a good one to believe? Is the term good in this question might be ambiguous between epistemically good and axiologically good. Right? So, and I think epistemology and axiology are tightly intertwined. Remember, axiology in general is the study of values, which, in my view, consists of both moral goods, ethics, and non-moral goods, aesthetics. If Margolis' claim is good to believe in the former sense, then it will likely need to be based on good, i.e. reasonable arguments for the position. This, of course, would require a full examination of the evidence for and against non-cognitivism. But suppose that non-cognitivism is about values is in fact epistemically good to believe. The evidence for non-cognitivism is better than its competitors. Would then maintaining non-cognitivism be axiologically good to believe? If the relativist says yes, then the relativist is maintaining something contrary to their own position. The values are non-cognitive. Right? So if you say that cognitivism is good about values, then you've given up non-cognitivism. To quote Homer, dope. That's Simpson, not the Greek Homer. The relativist might respond that they only mean that the relativistic position is non-cognitive, and that the anti-relativistic position, which maintains that non-cognitivism is not axiologically good to believe, is equally axiologically good as the relativistic position. Thus, the relativist would have to believe that her own position was axiologically as good as a rejection of her own position. Now, that seems absurd. This seems absurd as it entails that one ought to reject the relativist's own position on axiological grounds, which seems to be something that a relativist would deny. So Margolis' second point, in addition to requiring a strong argument in favor of non-cognitivism, seems to lead to an absurd position in which the relativism that non-cognitivism supposedly entails is both axiologically good and axiologically bad, simultaneously. Talk about an absurdity. So once again, this is the main problems with relativism, is that it's self-defeating, whether it's in ontology or epistemology or axiology, including aesthetics. So that means you should reject it. Now, such a rejection doesn't tell us which natural objects or works of art are beautiful or ugly. It merely opens at least the possibility of there being such aesthetic realities. And that's pretty good news. So, hopefully this video has convinced you to reject aesthetic relativism and be open to the possibility of the reality of beauty. Thanks so much for watching.
Stay psyched, Grom.